We are very thrilled to have Reverend Dr. Mike Petrow, who has completed his degrees in religion, psychology, and mythology. He's worked as a youth pastor, a spiritual director, and a teaching pastor. He likes God, dogs with a capital D. I'm not sure why it's a capital D, but I like dogs too. Dogs are good. Good conversation, good people. He's passionate about how sacred stories teach us how to live our own story. He works for the Center for Action and Contemplation in Albuquerque, the Richard Rohr Center. And I'm just thrilled as heck to have you talking to us today, Mike. Please welcome Mike Petrow. Let's fix this.
Is it right here?
But you got to do the mic so they can.
Okay, let me know. Because left to my own devices, I'll walk around and then that'll leave me off.
Just take it with you if you want to walk around.
Oh goodness. Try this because I can't navigate both. Seems this.
Perfect. Nice outfit there, Mike.
Thank you so much. Happy Easter, everybody. It's good to see you. This is how many years in a row have we done this that I've got to come up
the fourth or fifth one.
Yeah, I always joke that I'm the token Christian who comes up for Easter Sunday. So oh my gosh, it's so good to see all of you. Happy Easter. I wanna just throw a little bit of love. Yesterday was the anniversary of the 18 years since the passing of my brother. So I've been thinking about him a lot. And when I think about resurrection, I always think about my grandpa John. When I was growing up, my grandpa John was the most terrifying man you would ever meet. I remember him being very cranky, getting in fights in public. He was not someone to be trifled with. And somewhere in there, I think around the time that I was 5 years old, he heard an accurate report that his grandkids were afraid of him, and he decided to become our favorite person. And I watched him transform from a very traumatized human who had a lot of anger to the kindest, funniest, most caring person I've ever met. And how he did it, I don't know, because I'm pretty sure he did it without therapy. But yeah, when I think about resurrection, I think about that. And we were talking about this morning. He'd grown up, he was a child of the Depression. His mom had passed when he was very young, and his dad had remarried, and his stepmother absolutely hated him. So he grew up in a violent home, and then he ended up out on the street. Joined the Marines in World War II. He survived 5 aquatic landings as a whole thing. But even in my younger years, when Grandpa John was scary, we had a familial practice that stayed through my mom's childhood into my childhood and my entire upbringing, which is that there was always an empty seat at the dinner table. And there's a clear, understood familial rule that we always set for one extra. And there was always a quick, easy addition that could be added to the table and more chairs that could be brought over. And we had a familial rule that if anyone had a friend who was in trouble, or their parents were going through something difficult and they didn't feel safe at home, or they didn't have anywhere to go, with no notice, you could bring anyone home for dinner. And we grew up that way my entire life. And it was because my grandpa John had been sort of on the street, and he'd been taken in by friends and family members who cared about him. And he taught us the value of passing that on. So that to me is what resurrection feels like. It's sort of when we turn our wounds into wisdom and our work in the world. And it doesn't need to be fancy, and it doesn't need to be extravagant, you know. I should look at my notes here, as I did write something for you. The idea that's been holding my attention lately, it's kind of become a passion and a hobby, is this idea that I refer to as the healer with 1,000 faces. And I'm going to guess in this crowd that some of you have read Joseph Campbell's book, The Hero with 1,000 Faces. This feels like a room where people might know that book. Joseph Campbell, the great mythologist who passed away in 1988, had looked at myths and stories from across the world's religions and cultures. And he said there's patterns we can identify that show up in all the great stories that show us how to live a life well, how to be the person that each and every one of us is uniquely called to be. And he called this the hero with 1,000 faces. And I really, really loved it. I have a PhD in comparative mythology and Jungian psychology, so I kind of had to read that text. It was kind of the Bible in the program that I was in. But something happened to me around 2020 during the pandemic when I was locked in with my cat and a bunch of books 2 months after I moved to Albuquerque, so I didn't know that many folks. And I had a lot of time on my hands, and I started getting curious. Started getting really, really interested in the lives of the spiritual teachers that I had learned from. But I suddenly got way more interested in how Carl Jung or Alan Watts or Mirabai Starr had lived the teachings that they shared with other people, more so than how they put it down in the books that they put out. And it got really, really interesting to me. I started reading memoir and biography. I'd never done this before. And I went really, really deep, and I started to notice a pattern that I would see over and over and over again. People would suffer something. They would do the work to heal from whatever they had suffered, and then they would turn around and they would put that healing in the service of healing the world and healing their neighbors, which is pretty beautiful, right? It was really interesting. And the shift for me was when I got less interested in figuring out how to be the hero of my own life and live in perpetual individuation forever, just trying to be the best Mike Petrow that I could be, which I think is great. I think there's a place for that. But I started to wonder more, how do I live my life in service to the world around me and the community around me in the way that I saw my grandpa John do that, When he experienced his healing, he put that healing in the service of loving other people well. And I realized part of the reason this got real important to me. So I'm studying this during the height of the pandemic, right? And so the Me Too movement is taking place. Black Lives Matter is resurging after the murder of George Floyd, which you and I remembered, I think was Holy Week, right? And I felt like fascism and tyranny were sort of flexing their muscles very publicly. In a way that was very terrifying. And I kept hearing all my friends ask this very simple question, which is, what can I do to make a difference myself? From my youngest friends to my oldest friends, from my pals to my great teachers, everybody asking the question, what is mine uniquely to do? And as we were all locked in, I saw something that I don't want to say it scared me, but it concerned me, which was watching my spiritual friends especially fall into two very dangerous traps, right? And the traps were nihilism or narcissism. To say it another way, it was checking out or burning out, right? The nihilism is it's hopeless and there's nothing you can do about it. And when you're really spiritual, and I'm not talking about anyone in this room, but I know some people who like their brand as being really spiritual. When you're really spiritual, nihilism hides in really sneaky places, right? And then the other trap was narcissism, thinking it's all about me or it's all on my shoulders. Have you ever looked at all the injustice and the hurt and the sorrow in the world and forgotten when you're like, what can I possibly do in the face of all the hurt that there is to heal? Forgetting that it's not just your job, right? You could never, none of us could ever heal the collective sorrows of the world by ourselves, but we can carry what's ours to do. And so what I saw is I saw friends checking out because what they would do is go, okay, well, it's impossible. And please understand I'm being playful here. So they would lean into, non-duality and listen, I'm a host of a podcast called Everything Belongs. So I get it, this like, it's all good. It's all part of God's plan. It's all part of Spirit's plan. It'll all work out. And I'll just work on my own meditation and sort of not worry about it. Then I saw other friends who were burning out because they were trying to do everything, right? They're like, I've got to get to every protest. I've got to do everything just right. I've got to make sure that, oh my God, did I accidentally throw away a piece of plastic that needed to be recycled? In this moment, in climate crisis, did I accidentally throw away a plastic lid? Did I accidentally, and stuff gets heavy. It gets heavy. And I saw friends burning out because they were trying to do everything. And I realized what was behind all of this was this simple question: what exactly is mine to do? Like, what's my lever and my place to stand? How am I called to make the difference that uniquely I can? And because I'm very blessed to work with a lot of amazing spiritual teachers in my job right now. I coordinate education for the Center for Action and Contemplation. So I talk to a lot of really phenomenal teachers and people doing great work in the world. And what I realized is, like, this is a lifetime question, right? It never goes away. You never stop asking, in this season of my life, what exactly is mine to make a difference right now? Even if I had it 5 years ago, 10 years ago, it's always changing as we grow and our life circumstance change. So I started wrestling with that question, and I got real interested in how my heroes were answering it. Adam Bucko says that we should always let our heartbreak be our guide. I had an old Irish mentor named Neil Gass from Belfast. I can't do his Irish accent anymore. I wish I could, but he would always remind me, Michael, the pain that you can feel is the pain that you can heal. And I'm sure that wasn't his original limerick, but it's a good one. It's a really good one. The pain that you can feel is the pain that you can heal. And what I started to see or wonder about is if the medicine that we each uniquely need to find is the same medicine that is ours then to share, right? My dear friend Carmen Acevedo Butcher, who's a teacher and a translator, I shared this with her one time, and she said, no, Michael, what actually happens is in our healing, we become the medicine. And once we become the medicine, we can't help but give it to the people around us. But it's a unique medicine, right? Mine is different than yours. And so I started to see this pattern emerge, and I got real interested. So I started setting up interviews with people that I respected, where I could ask them, like, hey, am I onto something? Is this real? Have you seen this in your life? If you're curious, I recorded a bunch of conversations, and I've started releasing them on a podcast called The Healer with a Thousand Faces. It's a shameless plug to listen to my podcast. I don't make any money from it. I just like doing it. Mirabai is my first episode. It's wonderful. But I saw something that became really, really clear to me, which is we come into this world, we're filled with wonder. Nobody gets out of this life unscathed. Every one of us gets wounded somehow. And so if I was interviewing each or any of you for the podcast, this is the first question I would ask you is there a wound that has shaped your life in an interesting way? You see, there was one more concept that really got me beyond the pain that you can feel is the pain that you can heal. My great teacher is a very dead Alexandrian from the 3rd century named Origen. And he said that if we stay with our wounds, I love this, they become health-bestowing wounds. Very wound in your life, the deepest wound in your life becomes a source of healing, right? And this idea of health-bestowing wounds became really, really fascinating to me. So I'd ask people, what wound has shaped your journey? There's a mythologist I really like named Martin Shaw, and he says, if we're not aware of our wounds, they come out in our life as drama, right? Carl Jung says, if we don't make them conscious, they rule our lives and we experience it as fate. So it's worth being in dialogue. Like, what are the wounds that have shaped my journey? And then I saw this sort of wounds in our life shape our wandering. They shape our unique life path. The direction our course goes is different. Mine is different than yours. Yours is different than mine. It's different than yours. But it's ours. It's our story. It's our story to heal and to share, right? And then after they shape our wandering, they shape our wondering. I think each and every one of us is blessed with a question or several questions to wrestle with. And your life quest is in the questions that are yours uniquely to ask and answer. And there's a new question for every season. It never goes away. Carl Jung, who's a hero of mine, and also I spent a lot of years studying his psychology, said, I feel very strongly that I'm under the influence of things or questions which were left incomplete and unanswered by my parents or grandparents or more distant ancestors. It often seems as if there were a karma within a family which is passed on from parents to children. It's always seemed to me that I had to answer questions which fate had posed to my forefathers and which had not yet been answered, as if I had to complete or perhaps continue things which previous ages had left unfinished. I know when I'm thinking about the healer with 1,000 faces, I'm carrying on a work that my grandfather handed to me. I'm carrying on a healing work that my brother Tim handed to me when he lost his life to depression, right? And that's all of us. It's not just our own healing that we're working on. The questions honestly are a gift. Origen says that the deepest matters of the spiritual life call for exploration, not explanation, and discussion, not definition. This is where we live. This is where we live, and it's good stuff. The next thing I saw is that the wounds, right, that led to wandering and wondering eventually would lead us to wisdom. When we sit with those questions, we find, one, our wisdom teachers, because we go looking for them. And when the student is ready, the teacher appears. And two, we find the wisdom that we need, and then that's our wisdom to share. So if I was interviewing you on a podcast, I would say, what is your wisdom uniquely that is yours to give? And not just with your words, but with the way that you live. Because what that wisdom inevitably does is it reminds you in every season of life what your work to do is. And that work is not often what you get paid for. It's how you show up as a parent or a partner or a peer or a patron. I really love alliteration if you can't tell. Or a person, right? It's my grandpa John who worked in a factory but made sure that there was an empty seat at the dinner table, and then spent the last 25 years of his life trying to make every stranger laugh, which most of the time was really good and sometimes put us in some very awkward situations. That's what guides us. And it being Easter Sunday, I promised Jenny that I would say something Christian. So I started thinking about this idea of the healer with 1,000 faces and this pattern. And I thought, God, you know, this is a little hokey, but what if I could interview Jesus of Nazareth on my podcast? And I could say to Jesus, what are the wounds that shaped your wandering, right? We've just come to the end of Holy Week. And in the majority of the Christian world, people look at Holy Week and they reflect on the passion of the Christ, right? I'm not talking about Mel Gibson's movie. They reflect on the wounds of Jesus. I think where the Christian world at large has missed the plot a little bit is that they focus on the wounds at the end of Jesus's life, right? I mean, that's fine, but they're looking at 1 week, right? And they're not looking at how Jesus turned his wounds into wisdom over the course of the 33 years that we know that he lived. And so that got really interesting to me. If I were to say to Jesus, what are the wounds that really shaped your life? What would he say? And trigger warning, there's some heavy shit that we're going to talk about in a second, but it's really, really interesting. When I started thinking about it, it changed the story for me a little bit. So starting at the beginning, and I'm gonna work with a biblical story because it's what we have, right? But if we just start there, some really interesting things emerge. The first thing we hear when you look at the Gospels is that Jesus' birth was very different and was very scandalous, okay? Because his mother mysteriously became pregnant. Now, heavy stuff we're going to talk about for a second. Most scholars are aware and discuss the fact that there was a persistent rumor that Mary, the mother of Jesus, may have been raped by a Roman soldier. This is a very common tragic, and horrifying reality for women living under the Roman occupation at the time. And so the early Christians would say this was a rumor created to discredit the virgin birth. And to all of us in this room, we can say respectfully, whatever did happen or didn't, to grow up with that story surrounding yourself and your family is a very particular wound that Jesus would have had to carry. Like, what would it mean for him growing up to know that his existence may have been the result of a crime committed against his mother? Or to know that his siblings, his step-siblings, even by the primary Christian story, his siblings were step-siblings, right? Would have looked at him differently. Or to carry the potential shame of knowing that his family and he was looked at different and his parents were discriminated against because of his birth. That's heavy. It's really, really heavy. So Jesus probably would have wrestled with questions like, who is my real father? And when you talk about turning a wound into wisdom, what we see in the story is someone who wrestled with the question, who is my real father? And came to the answer, God's my father. Love is my father, and not just me. All of us. You're a child of divine love, as are you and as are all of us. Who's my father? Who are my siblings? Everyone. That, friends, is turning your wound into wisdom, right? That's pretty profound. And whatever abuses have been done in the name of the Christian story, and there have been many, the gift of taking that wound and turning it into the message that everyone is a child of God because God is love, that's pretty beautiful. That's some good medicine to share with the world. Another wound that the story tells us Jesus carried from very young was that twice in the first few years of his life, his family was forced to relocate because of the Roman Empire. The story that we celebrate at Christmas tells the story of Mary and Jesus being forced to relocate because of a census. Am I allowed to swear here?
Yes.
That's some real bullshit. Could you imagine that? Literally, they're being like, we want to count everybody, so travel to the place of your birth, regardless of how long it takes. Doesn't matter if it disrupts your business, right? Doesn't matter if it uproots your family. And we're also told very clearly in the story that Joseph took Mary with him because it wasn't safe to leave her alone because of the scandal around her pregnancy. That's the first one. The second one is, the story of Herod and the Magi, and they come and they tell Herod a story, and then he's like, I'm going to kill all the children. That's a pretty intense story. What we know is that one way or another, according to the story, Jesus' family had to flee a politically driven massacre or violence, right? And they had to run away. Before Jesus was old enough to hold up his own head, the boot of empire was on his neck. That is a wound to carry. And it probably left him with some pretty heavy questions. What do I do with empire and fascism? How do I reconcile the kingdom of this world? How do I render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's? You've heard that saying, render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's. The answer, the way that Jesus turned that wound into wisdom, is to decide that he was a citizen of what he called the kingdom of God, first and foremost, before he was a captive of the empire. What does it mean, the kingdom of God? There's a lot of theories about this. My personal favorite, if you read Jesus' teachings in depth, he's always saying things like, hey, look at the birds. Look at the flowers. Don't be anxious about tomorrow. Birds and flowers don't worry about anything more than just being a bird or being a flower. And yet they're well-fed and more beautiful than a king on their throne in all their plumage. Jesus is constantly using natural metaphors. So sidebar, another thing that our wounds do is they lead us to our wandering. Jesus most likely was a bit of an outcast, so he seems to have spent a lot of time in the wilderness. Tells us that he constantly withdrew to the wilderness to pray, but he also was clearly paying attention. And I think when Jesus is talking about the kingdom of God, what he's actually talking about is the natural world, right? And what he's saying is empire is insustainable, but the natural world focuses on harmony and sustainability. And as such, it will eventually and inevitably outlast empire because empire is insustainable. It's a theory. It's a good one. And then what he did was he lived from that place of sustainability. He practiced abundance as opposed to scarcity and competition. You know that story where he takes 5 loaves and 2 fishes and he breaks it up and he feeds like 10,000 people with it? What he's demonstrating in that is that love creates more love, right? There's no competition in love. When I love you, it creates more love for both of us to share in the world. And that's Jesus turning a wound into wisdom. Back it up a bit. Jesus had to flee, right? He was a cultural refugee, political refugee when he was a child. If you've heard the theory of the lost years of Jesus, anyone know that one? Where it's like, how did Jesus learn all this wisdom? He may have gone to India and studied. I will not take that theory away from you. It's a beautiful thing. Maybe it happened when he was in his 20s. But what's wild is the story tells us something very specific that as contemporary readers, we don't know that we're reading when it tells us. The story tells us that Jesus' family fled to Egypt. More on that in a second, but we know this. Being an exile who grew up in Egypt, that would have made Jesus what a lot of people call a third culture kid, right? He would have been from a redneck backwater town in Judea going to Egypt and being too Jewish to fit in Egypt. And then when his parents came back, he'd have been too Egyptian to fit in Judea, right? So it would have left him with this question, where is my home? And he says this famous thing, foxes have holes and birds have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. And so Jesus would have wrestled with the question, where is my home? And who is my neighbor? And in turning his wounds into wisdom, what answer did he come up with? Everyone is my neighbor when I treat them with love, right? And so we see these stories of Jesus in a patriarchal culture, being friends with women. Actually, if you know how to read the Gospels, women were his primary disciples. You see women constantly getting it, and the men sort of being like, but Jesus, we don't get it. And he's like, you guys are driving me crazy, constantly. The Gospel is filled with stories of Jesus having verbal sparring matches with people and defeating them. There is exactly, check me on this, there is one story where Jesus loses a verbal debate, and it's with a Syrophoenician woman, and that is not an accident. It is his paying respect to a woman as his teacher in that moment. Mary Magdalene, probably his closest disciple and most trusted confidant, and even in Eastern Orthodox teaching, the apostle to the apostles. Jesus ate dinner with supposed outcasts and sinners. No one was an outcast to him. He saw no stranger because growing up as a liminal person who was fully at home nowhere, he chose to make everyone his neighbor and make everywhere his home and make people feel at home. That is turning your wound into wisdom. And I also just have to add, because I'm such a nerd about this, I was telling you, Jesus was relocated to Egypt, right? I don't know why no one teaches this. Does anybody know what the northernmost city in Egypt was that they would have come to when they fled to Egypt? Alexandria, yeah. Absolutely. So Jesus would have fled to Alexandria. Does anybody remember what Alexandria was famous for? A library. Alexandria was the seat of the world's first information age. As Alexander was going east, all the knowledge that he was finding, he was sending back to the library. So it was this giant cultural conversation about spirituality and philosophy from the world over. There's rumors that Emperor Asoka, a Buddhist emperor, sent missionaries to Alexandria. The Alexandrian librarians, every time a ship came into their port, they would board the ship and say, do you have any religious or philosophical scrolls? Can we copy them? And there was a deeply sophisticated Hellenized community of Jews in Alexandria who were way involved in this conversation about world mythology, philosophy, and spirituality. So in Alexandria, Jesus would have received an education that would like blow your mind. There's this great story where he's a tween and his parents come back to visit the temple and they lose him and they find him debating the religious leaders. And they're like, how could he possibly know so much? If you don't know the ancient world, you're like, because God dropped, like God gave him a download of all the knowledge in all the world and he had the internet inside his brain because he's the son of God. And sure. But what the story is trying to tell us is that in Alexandria, Jesus would have been studying and learning not just about the Torah, but about spiritual technologies and wisdom from all over the world. Our wounds lead us to our wandering, and we get to choose if they lead us into a world that is smaller or bigger. And we get to choose that over and over and over again. I'm way off my notes, everybody. Sorry. I just get excited about this stuff. Let's see. Before we run out of time, what else can I tell you? Jesus was mistreated by others, most likely, right? He was a dubious birth. He was probably way too citified for his like down country folks when he came back home from Egypt. You know, like nobody knew what to do with him, and you can see that in the story. So a question he probably wrestled with his entire life is, how do I treat people who mistreat me? And he turned his wounds into wisdom when he came up with the principle, don't do to others how they do to you. Do unto others as you would have them do to you. Something that's been said more recently as, be the change you want to see in the world. Jesus chose to live as a citizen of the kingdom of love and make that real in every interaction he had, regardless of how people were treating him, which is pretty cool. Jesus, I have a teacher named Barbara Holmes who used to say, the only way you can really, really get what Jesus was in that time and place, regardless of divinity or not, was that Jesus was a first century shaman. You see him talking to dead people, you see him healing people. And he did this really interesting thing where he would say to someone who was physically sick, your sins are forgiven, and then he would miraculously heal them. And the thing to notice there, is as a person who probably grew up playing worthiness games in his head, because he was always told that he was less than, he had learned things that we now learn, like trauma lives in the body, our secrets make us sick. When we are trapped in worthiness games, it physically manifests in our body in adverse ways. And he realized that when we get liberated from our worthiness games, it literally has a healing effect on who we are physically and how we show up in the world. I mean, that's great. That's putting your wounds in the service of healing. I'll say this and then done. What do I have, like 3 minutes left? I can do this. Watch this. Joseph, Jesus' stepfather, is not around in most of the Gospels, so he probably died early. And Jesus watched his cousin John the Baptist get executed for preaching and teaching, right? Personal transformation in the face of an empire. So Jesus knew that death was a reality for him. But he knew that there was a more dangerous death, which was to lose your soul, right? The worst threat of death was to lose your soul. And so the reason he could face the threat of execution and then bravely carry his cross was because he'd been carrying it his entire life. He'd been turning his wounds into wisdom his entire life. And he knew as a result that every death is merely a resurrection in process, right? So Christians talk about the imitation of Christ. That's awesome. My dear friend Carmen, when I talked about all these W's that I love, our wounds lead us to our wondering and our wandering and our wisdom and our work. She said, yeah, but don't forget, they lead us to our weird more than anything. They break us out of the boxes that society tries to put us in. Jesus was a real weirdo, like in the best way. He was a hippie before hippies were hippies. And so Carl Jung says this thing I love. He says, are we to understand the imitation of Christ in the sense that we should copy his life, and if I may use the expression, ape or copy his stigmata, his wounds, right? Copy his wounds? Or in the deeper sense that we are to live our own proper lives as truly as he lived his in its individual uniqueness? How do we keep turning our wounds into wisdom and good work. How do you do that? How do I do that? I mean, that's the question, right? And how do we let that shape us into the true weirdos that we are? I always go back to Alan Watts, and I'll go out on this note saying, I have always done things in my own way, which is at once the way that comes naturally to me, that is honest, sincere, genuine, and unforced, but also perverse. Although you must remember that this word means through, verse, which is poetry, out of the way and wayward, which is surely towards the way. And that to be queer, to follow your own weird, is wholeheartedly to accept your own karma or fate or destiny, and thus to be odd in the service of God.
Good.
In whose service, as the Anglican Book of Common Prayer declares, is perfect freedom. May we all let our wounds be turned into wisdom as we find our own glorious weirdness, and let that be in the work of healing the world. Thank you very much.